Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We'll start in about a minute. I'd like to give just a minute more for people who are always joining on time. But while we wait, I'd invite you all to write into the chat over here. What roles do you play in your organizations? Because this whole webinar is for non-developers. So are you still a developer? Are you more on the consultancy side? What are your roles? Let's see where the interest is coming from. Okay, consultants, both developers, sales, product. Okay. Good. So I see that we have a mix of roles. And also, I think that the majority of people who wanted to join are already in the call. So welcome. Welcome to this year's new webinar. Welcome to Azure Blobs Made Simple for non-developers. As always, I like to start these webinars by sort of explaining where's the reason behind the creation of this webinar. And for this one, it was actually an email that came from you, from partners, asking, could you help us understand Azure Blob Storage a bit more? Because the examples in the documentation are not really good, and everything just points to the price calculator, which is messy, to say the least. And when I take a look at the price calculator, well, I have to agree. So that's when we started to think about what if we took Azure Blob Storage, which is traditionally a technical topic, and instead of talking about APIs, instead of talking about how do we connect with Azure Blob Storage, we make a session for non-developers. We talk about the considerations that you have to think about when you decide to go for something like this. And in the end, also, how much will all of this cost? Now, before we go any deeper into the topic, I'll just take a quick minute to introduce myself. My name is 𝐀𝐳𝐮𝐫𝐞, and I'm a developer here at 𝐀𝐳𝐿. I mainly play around with Business Central and Azure because these two are a love story. They love to play with each other. And about a year and a half ago, I also realized that I really like doing this sort of knowledge sharing sessions. I like finding the little things. I like simplifying things and then sharing those with you, with the community. And that being said, this topic came to be because one of you requested, could you help us simplify blob storage? And I would invite you, if you have more topics that you would like to see simplified or just explained in a different way, shoot me a message, shoot 𝐀𝐳𝐿 a message. And if there's a wider interest, well, maybe we'll make it into a webinar. But if we get back to the content today, what are we going to talk about? First, we're going to talk about where did this need for blob storage come from? I mean, we've all been working with NAV for the past 20 years and never have we had a problem with storing blobs, with storing files. Why do we now suddenly need this external Azure Blob Storage resource? Once we establish that, we're going to talk a little bit about storage considerations. We're going to talk about the alternatives, what are the pros and what are the cons of each of them. Finally, we're going to try and do our best to simplify the cost calculator. And together, we're going to emulate a scenario and come in the end with a price that you can actually present to your customers, as in, this is how much things are going to cost per month. And then we're going to wrap everything up and finish. So let's start with what are blobs, and let's start with the actual word, with the name itself. Blob stands for a binary large object. Now that means either a picture, a document, a PDF document, a CSV file. It's any sort of file. So throughout the presentation, I might be talking about blobs, I might be talking about files. These are the same thing. And in the good old NAV days, there's three ways how we could store the files, more or less. We could either store the files directly in the database, in the NAV database. The second option, if the user needed that file, we could store that file directly onto the user's PC. So when somebody invoked an action in NAV, the developer had the option to write the code and say, store this into C/users/tnet documents work, whatever. On the other side of things, we could also store files directly onto our servers. So we could do something like store the file to C shared finance invoices, whatever. So those were the most common ways where we stored files. And now, where's the difference? Why does that no longer work? Well, part of it is because we're no longer on NAV. Now we're working with Business Central. And the first change that happened was users no longer use Windows clients to access Business Central. They use a browser, Edge, Safari, Chrome, whatever. And browsers, for security reasons, they don't let any website access the files on a user's computer directly. Because, I mean, think about it. Would you really want to go to a random website and that website could read your documents or put a file somewhere on your PC? You don't want that. So from the user perspective, now we only always need user interaction. The user needs to download the file from Business Central in order to store it on their own PC. On the other side, at the very beginning, we still had the same option of storing files directly to the server, shared finance invoices, and we stored the file there. But then there was another difference that came with Business Central, and that was the cloud. Now, when I, as a developer, would try to write some code to store the file on C/shared/finances/invoices, and I would like to use that code on cloud servers, I won't be able to. My extension will never be installed into a cloud environment. And why is that? Why is the cloud different than our on-premise server? Well, if we take a closer look at the cloud is essentially just a very large number of different servers that Microsoft owns all over Europe, all over the world. So today, for example, if I connect to Business Central online, I might be connecting to this server over here in the top right corner. And then a week from now, if I connect again, I might actually be connecting to this server down here. So if you think about it, if today I would want to store a file on C/shared/finances, that would be stored on this server. And a week from now, when I would like to read that file, it would be try to read it from this server and the file wouldn't exist. So that's part of the reason why we can't really store files on cloud servers. The second reason is purely from security perspective. Microsoft doesn't want us to store random files on their servers because that could compromise their infrastructure if a bad actor would try to upload some bad code onto their servers. So, okay, that means if we're working with cloud servers, we cannot store files directly on the server, but if we're working with on-prem servers, we still can, right? Well, not really. From this year onwards, well, technically you still can store files onto your on-prem servers, but you will have to pay an increasing amount of money to be able to do that. And that's because of something called Universal Code Initiative. I believe that most of you already know this one, but basically what Universal Code Initiative is Microsoft said, look, all of the code that you write has to work both in the cloud and on-prem. And since we've just established that storing files to the server does not work on cloud, that means you cannot use that same code on-prem as well. From this January onwards, if you have such code that is storing files directly to the server, you will have to pay $75 per user per year in order to be able to run this code. And those $75, the price is just going to go up in the future. Okay, next. So we know that we cannot store files on the cloud. We don't really want to store files on our servers directly. But still, why did we even store files on the servers in the first place? I've identified two kind of cases throughout my experience, but also when I was talking with other partners. One of the cases was we want to store files for archive purposes. We want all of our invoices to be stored in a specific folder where we can access all of them. The second one was where Business Central drops off a file on the server, and then a third-party application, something like a document management system, a CRM, a payment processor, whatever application goes and picks up that file and processes it. So for integration purposes was the second scenario why we used to drop files off on the server. So now we know what the requirement was. So we still need to store files somewhere, either for archive purposes or for integration purposes. So what are our options? Well, the easiest one that is still available is you can store your files directly into the Business Central database. I'm not a fan of this option, but we're going to talk about pros and cons in a second. The second option is you can say, well, I'm willing to pay $75 per user per month, and you can still write files to the actual server, but you will be paying the fees for non-UCI, non-Universal Code Initiative compliant code. Then there's the third option. The third option is that you take your on-prem servers. This part is going to be a bit more difficult to explain, but stay with me. What we cannot do is we cannot write files directly to the disk. We cannot write code that would say store the file to C shared finance invoices. However, we can send files through the internet to endpoints, to APIs. So one of the possible solutions that you can have is you can expose your existing server so that it has an API. And what do I mean by it has an API? It has a public address, something like https API 𝐀𝐳𝐮𝐫𝐞 /file storage /upload. And then Business Central can send the file to that endpoint. In that case, you will still be storing files on your server, but since you are not writing directly to the disk, this is allowed and you won't be paying the additional fees for Universal Code Initiative. And then there's the fourth way. You can use an external solution for that. I noticed somebody mentioned SharePoint in the chat at the beginning. Unfortunately, I won't be really talking about SharePoint and other third-party applications that you can use for storing files. I'll be mainly focusing on Azure Blob Storage. Now, we can think of Azure Blob Storage as this virtual folder that is somewhere on Microsoft servers. And what Microsoft does is they provide us with an API, just like we talked before. They provide us with an API, and then Business Central can send that file to that API, which means the file will be stored in that virtual folder. So the API could look something like this: easyblobs.blobs core Windows net /financials, and this financials is our folder. And then a third-party app that needs to access these files for integration purposes could download them from this same exact endpoint. Okay, so we have four ways how we can store the files. We can store them in the database. We can store them directly on the server using non-UCI compliant code. We can expose the server and store the file by sending it to an API, or we can use Azure Blob Storage. So let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each of these options. First, storing files in the database. I'm not saying that this is a completely bad option. I've seen it work quite well for smaller customers. Some of the benefits that it has is it's easy to implement. You only need to know AL code to get all of this working. It's easy to deploy. As soon as you install your Business Central extension, everything works. And there are no data security issues. What I mean by data security issues, and what I'll mean by that moving forward, is you as a partner, you don't have to worry about who has access to those files. The customer has to make sure that they implement correct security and only authorized people have access to those files. And since the data stays with the customer, it's their responsibility. What are some bad sides of storing files into the database? Well, the most obvious one is it grows the database size. From the get-go, you get 80 gigabytes of database size. And then for each essential user, you get an additional 2 gigs, or for a premium user, you get 3 gigs, which means a small company that has roughly 10 Business Central users would start with 100 gigabytes of database size. Now, as I said, I have seen smaller companies work completely fine by storing files directly into the database. But the problem is, once you work long enough with that same database, or once your company grows, you are going to start hitting those limits. And once you do hit the limits of your database sizes, the additional gigabyte of storage costs $10, and the additional 100 gigabytes cost $500. And those prices are quite big comparing to how much the alternatives cost. Additional downsides to storing everything in the database is that file backups are tied directly to database backups. So if today I, for example, accidentally deleted one file and I would like to get it back, somebody needs to restore the full Business Central database backup somewhere so I can pull that file out. Okay, the next option, the one I dislike the most, is still storing files using non-UCI compliant code. On the pro side, still it checks all the same boxes as storing into the database does. You're just using AL code, it's easy to deploy, you only need that extension and the data stays with their customers. Sure. But what are the downsides? One, we're excluding our customers from moving to the cloud. And right now, everybody at some point has a wish to go to the cloud because, well, maybe not everyone, but a lot of customers do, because nobody wants to work with infrastructure anymore. And by having non-universal, non-UCI compliant code, that customer will have to re-implement the solution before they will actually be able to go to the cloud. Next, it's becoming quite expensive. Like I said, from this January, $75 per user per year. That's going to go up to $125, later on even $250, and further down the road, we don't even know. And additionally, if you store files on the server, there are no backups, there are no audit trails. You don't know who has accessed those files, and there's no security, meaning that anybody who has access to that server will automatically also have access to these files. The better alternative, if you still want to store files onto your server, onto your existing server, is storing the files through an API. So like we said, you expose your server and then send the files from Business Central to that API. The best thing about it is that there's no additional running costs. You already have that server because you need it to host Business Central. Again, no data security issues, the data still stays with the customer. On the downside, one, it makes it difficult to migrate to the cloud. Let me explain this one. Let's say that we have our on-prem Business Central that also sends the files to our on-prem server. Once we move Business Central to the cloud, that Business Central will still be sending file to this on-prem server. So the whole benefit of moving to the cloud is we no longer have to worry about infrastructure. But because we still have this dependency that Business Central is storing files to our on-prem server, we cannot just get rid of that server. We first have to re-implement this file storage solution. Next, it requires additional software. So exposing a server through the internet is not as simple as just ticking a box somewhere. You need some software that will create that API that Business Central can contact. Then these are harder to deploy and harder to maintain. For us as developers, there's nothing more frustrating than having to log on to various different environments that customers have, because they have different servers, they have different firewalls, they have different networking issues, they have different security policies. And in the end, one fix that might work for one customer will not work for the other customer. And that's frustrating to maintain. Additionally, still storing the files directly on the server, out of the box, there's no backups, no audit trail, and no security. Of course, these points can be solved with additional software, but just keep that in mind. And then blob storage. Let's see what's good about blob storage. The first 2 points are kind of connected. No infrastructure concern, highly scalable, and easy migration to the cloud. Like I said before, it's quite frustrating if each customer has a different server and a different firewall and all of the setup there. If you're using Azure Blob Storage, it's all standardized. Everything is the same for each customer. Each customer is going to be sending the files to the same Azure Blob Storage, which you get to know. What I mean by highly scalable is that in the previous scenario, when we get a new customer, we first need to expose their server, which can take more time. But with Azure Blob Storage, we can fully automate the process that when a customer downloads our application from AppSource, it will automatically create a new virtual folder somewhere on Azure, somewhere on Microsoft servers, and that customer will just start sending the files to that new virtual folder. So it makes it highly scalable because you can start adding more customers without having to deal so much with each one of them. With the easy migration to the cloud, this goes to the previous point, where we had Business Central on-prem that was sending the files to the server that was also on-prem. If now we have Business Central on-prem that sends files to the virtual folder in Azure, we move Business Central to the cloud, it can still send the files to that same virtual folder, and that server that we previously had and we had to pay for it, we can throw it out the window now because there's no need for it anymore. Then we have backups, soft delete, audit trails, a couple of different pros. We'll talk about backups a bit later. So now I want to move to the, let's call it, more bad sides of Azure Blob Storage compared to the other ones. Again, first 2 points connect to one another. You need Azure setup and you need people with Azure knowledge. Suddenly, you're moving away from developers that just need to know AL. And I'm not saying that each developer should have an Azure certification, but in our organizations, we need to have people who know what Azure does, how to set up Azure. And previously, in my point that with Azure Blob Storage, solutions can be highly scalable because when somebody downloads an app from AppSource, it will automatically create a new virtual folder for them. Well, that's good, but that needs to be part of a deployment strategy. And that's, again, something to think about, something that you have to set up on Azure. So, of course, adding a third-party solution like Azure Blob Storage brings additional complexity to your architecture. And finally, Azure Blob Storage comes with data security concerns. What I mean by that is Previously, we always stored files with the customer into their database or onto their servers. Now, with Azure Blob Storage, and here I'm talking about if Azure Blob Storage is provisioned on ours, on partners' tenants, if data goes to our tenants, we have to be the ones to think about how do we handle that data? How do we store that data? How do we secure that data? How do we delete that data when the customer no longer wants to do business with us? But this is not a deal breaker, but it is a concern that you need to think about. Now with blob storage, there's an additional, let's call it, differentiation that we need to keep in mind. I've seen this in the wild quite a couple of times. You can either have an Azure Blob Storage resource, let's call it like that, in your partner's tenant, or you can create it in your customer's tenant. So let's compare the two a bit. First, I'll start with this. If you're an ISV and you have an ISV solution, I really think you should opt for the partner tenant option. The reason for it being is it's much easier to deploy. It offers a better onboarding experience and it's more scalable. Let me explain what exactly I mean by that. It goes back to the point I made earlier. If I download your app from App Source, I can either start using it immediately because behind the scenes, you already, as a partner, you have everything automated. You've automatically created a new virtual folder where the files will be stored for me, and there's no setup needed on my side. Now, on the other hand, if your model is, no, we're gonna create an Azure Blob Storage account in the customer's tenant, well, then I have to think about when will I schedule a call between my engineer and your engineer, so you two can they can set up everything the way it has to be set up on the customer's tenant, and only then can I start using the application. So when it comes to the onboarding experience, it's better if I can just start using it, but it's also better for scalability purposes, because if you as a partner don't need to schedule calls all day long, you can simply onboard 30 customers instead of 5 customers per day. Now, as I mentioned, if you have the Azure Blob Storage in the partner's tenant, there are data security concerns connected with it. If the Azure Blob Storage is in the customer's account, well, then you don't have to worry about data security because the data stays with them. There's also a couple of billing concerns. You know, if we create the resource in the customer's tenant, they will have to pay for all the capacity that they use up, for all the costs that the blob storage will incur. On the other hand, if we keep it in the partner's tenant, we have to think about how are we going to bill that to our customers? Are we going to have some flat rate? Are we going to bill them everything that they consume? You know, again, not a deal breaker, but something we have to think about. Okay, so that's about it in terms of pros and cons between the different options of where can we store the files. Now we're going to talk about price considerations. And how we're going to do that is, first, we're going to go to the price calculator, just so I can show you how messy it is when you first get to meet it. Then we're going to get back to the PowerPoint. We're going to deep dive into 4 topics over here: access tier, redundancy, capacity, and read-write operations, because these can have quite an impact on the price calculation. And then we're going to go back to the price calculator, and we're going to go together through a case where we're going to model a price for a small company. So let me switch to the price calculator over here to log in again. Okay. Let me just delete the previous data. This is where you would land once you would Google pricing calculator for Azure. And here you can see all of the different products that Azure has, and we can calculate price for it. For us right now, the interesting one is this one, storage accounts. This is an icon for Blob Storage. We can see that it's added, which means it's added down here. And when you start with it, it doesn't look too complicated. First, we set up a region. Okay, that I know. I'll just find my Europe region. Okay, North Europe. Just an FYI, region does not impact price at all. So this doesn't really matter for Azure Blob Storage. Type, okay, Blob Storage. We know that we want Blob Storage, but there's already plenty of different options over here. Let's stick with Blob Storage. Performance, this is where it already gets confusing. Do I need premium? Is standard okay? Which storage account I should use? File structure, do I need flat, hierarchical, access tiers, redundancy with a bunch of random letters? Well, before we actually start setting these fields up, let's go back to the PowerPoint and let's talk about a couple of these points into more details. First, the access tiers. We have 4 different access tiers to choose from: hot, cool, cold, and archive. Now, access tiers, you can think of them as just different types of storage accounts. And you can see from the slides, cooler tiers offer cheaper storage, while hotter tiers offer cheaper read and write operations. So hot storage accounts are good when the files are frequently being read or frequently being written to, while the cooler ones are where you drop off the files and you don't want to touch them. For our price calculation, I would say always start with hot. You'll see that, well, the reason for this is hot is really simple to input into the price calculator. When it comes to cool and cold and archive, if you start hitting capacities of 500 gigabytes or maybe more, that's when you can start thinking about colder storage accounts to optimize your costs. But at that point, I really would invite you to invite the architects or the developers in your companies to help you with this price estimation, because it no longer is just a few clicks on the price calculator and you would get the correct estimate. Redundancy. I'll be short on this one because in most cases it won't matter as much, but still I want us to understand what are those weird letters that we see on the price calculator. There's 3 types that you should know of: locally redundant storage, zone redundant storage, and geographically redundant storage. These options specify, how to put this. Let's say I have my virtual folder on one server in Microsoft data center, right? What if that server catches fire? Is all of my data lost? Well, if I have locally redundant storage, that means that even if server 1 fails, my data is still safely secured on server number 2 and server number 3 in the same room. So this one prevents any hardware failures. And every Azure Blob Storage account comes with at least locally redundant storage. So we can safely be assured that hardware failures won't impact our data. Now, zone redundant storage takes it a bit further. If the whole data center in Amsterdam fails, I can still have my data safely stored in Rotterdam. Okay? And then geographically redundant storage takes it even further. If all of Netherlands is unavailable, my data is still safely secured in Ireland. Now, keep in mind, this is not a backup. We're gonna be talking about data backups a bit later. This is just how do we prevent our data being lost due to something going wrong on Microsoft's side. Okay, then with capacity, this whole pricing scheme is pay as you go. meaning that if today I have 200 gigabytes in my storage account, at the end of the month, I'm going to pay for 200 gigabytes. If the next day I delete 180 gigabytes, at the end of that month, I'm going to pay for only 20 gigabytes. So you only pay for the capacity that you're actually using. And you can see the prices here are scaling linearly. So 10 gigs, 22 cents, 1 terabyte, $22. And you can also already see that if we switch to colder tiers, a terabyte of data goes for $3.60 in a cold tier and 99 cents in an archive tier. So again, I would say roughly above 500 gigabytes is where maybe I would start looking into optimizing storage with colder tiers. So as we said, hotter storage accounts are more expensive for capacity, but they are cheaper for read and write operations. And that being said, Azure Blob Storage, well, the storage accounts are made for millions of operations. And the BC workloads that we are trying to accommodate, well, they produce negligible numbers. Because let's take an example. Let's say I have a small company that produces about 1,000 files per month that they would like to store somewhere. And even that 1,000 files seems quite a number to me. Let's be safe and let's say that equates to 2,000 write operations. On the price calculator, you will see that the pricing starts at 10,000 operations minimum. So the numbers that we can produce with BC workloads don't really matter. And in the bottom part here, you can see that I have written out how I would normally calculate mathematically which numbers to put into the price calculator. However, as you'll see in a bit, it doesn't really make any significant difference. So let's switch to the price calculator and let me show you what I mean. We're going to set, okay, we set our region, we set our type, performance. We didn't really talk about performance because we don't have to. Just stick with standard. Premium is applicable once you hit about 40 operations per second. We are not coming even close to those numbers. So stick with standard. Storage account type, stick with general purpose v2. Even though this one says blob storage, these two options, we should consider them legacy. So just stick with general purpose v2. File structure, we have two options. Hierarchical is more used in the data analytics, data science workloads. That's not us, so we're going to go with flat namespace. Access tiers, 4 different types, as we said. For our calculations, let's stick to hot. Redundancy, there's multiple options. We've explained what these 3 are. Personally, for blob storage accounts, I always keep this as locally redundant storage. However, when we're going to talk about backups, the actual data backups, those I sometimes do consider making at least zone redundant, if not even geo redundant. More on that later. Before we calculate capacity, I just want to show you again, 1,000 gigabytes in a hot tier, $22. 1,000 gigabytes in a cold tier, $3.6. So even when you come up with huge numbers, and I have an example of that later, you can optimize and get an even better price on the storage. So now let's talk about how do we calculate how much capacity should we input here. Well, if you're approaching this as if your customer has a lot of data in their database and we need to move that to blob storage, well, just take whatever they have and plop it in here and see how much that's going to cost from day one. But for a new company, I would approach this with, okay, so I have, let's say my company creates 1,000 files per month. One file is roughly 1 megabyte. That would make 1 gigabyte per month. In a year, that would be 12 gigabytes, 3 years, 36. And let's say they had some data from before that we want to move up. And I'm going to round it up to 100 gigabytes. 100 gigabytes is not something that the customer is gonna pay from day one. This is how much they are going to pay 3 years from now once they do hit the 100 gigabytes. Because as we talked, this is pay as you go. You only pay for the capacity that you're actually using. Reserved instances, keep blank. We don't need that. This is not applicable to us. And now write operations. We talked about, you can see the formulas on the slides, but realistically, let me just show you, if I have 1,000 files per month, I'm going to way overestimate this and just say, okay, that's going to be 10,000 write operations and 10,000 list and create container operations. From the formula, you would see that the recommendation for read operations is 5 times the amount of write operations. So let's go with 50,000 read operations over here and 10,000 other operations. So we have hugely overestimated how many operations will actually happen, and we're talking about 13 cents. So even if I go way overboard and say 50,000 write, 50,000 list operations, 250,000 read operations, and 50,000 other operations, we're at 62 cents. So even if you really estimate this incorrectly, you're talking about $1 price of $1 difference in the end estimate. But let me just put this back to our initial values. Okay, data retrieval from the slides, you might have seen that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because 1,000 gigabytes, 0. 1,000 terabytes, still 0. So for hot storage accounts, this doesn't matter. For cold storage accounts, it matters, but we don't have time to go into that right now. And this is how much it would cost us to, after 3 years, a customer with this kind of workload of storing 1,000 files per day would have to pay roughly $2.32 per month. Okay, jumping back into the slides over here. One more thing we have to consider in our price estimations are the actual backups. 3 points to remember about data backups. Backing up your data, that you can then actually restore that backup, that's a separate Azure resource. It's going to cost roughly the same as blob storage. There are going to be differences, but it's similar. And even backups can be optimized for cooler tiers. Here I have, again, this is just for when you get the slides that you can remember how we kind of set up the price calculator. I won't go over these lines over here. Instead, I'll just jump back into our pricing calculator and let's add the backup onto our calculation over here. To get the backup, we need to find a new product, which we're going to search for up here with backup, Azure backup. We added it. Okay. Region, we pick whichever region we want. Again, region won't impact the price. Type, this says on the slides, you have to specify Azure files. Capacity, this should be the same as the capacity you've put down for storage accounts. So I'll put down 100 gigabytes. And then backup policy. This is how long you would like to retain your backups. Usually, the safest choice that I go for, well, it's not the safest choice, but it's a choice that I feel comfortable with, is daily backups retained for 30 days. Weekly backups are going to be retained for 16 weeks. Monthly backups for 6 months and yearly backups for 1 year. Now, this will impact pricing. So if you feel more comfortable with shorter backup retention policies, go for shorter retention policies. These numbers are also on the slides, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, average daily data churn, keep on low. We won't get into that one. Redundancy, this has the same values as blob storages. I said that for blobs, I always keep locally redundant storage. For backups, I prefer to go at least to a zone redundant. So even if everything goes wrong in Amsterdam, I can be sure that at least my backups are somewhere far away in Rotterdam. Performance tier, this one here specify hot. Again, it says this on the slides as well. And this is how we come up to our monthly cost for the backups of that Azure Blob Storage. Let me just switch to euros. This is going to be better for us. And here we can see now the total cost. The total cost for the storage account and the backups would be €5.84. Finally, I've made a couple of comparisons. I've modeled 3 different companies, so we can have 3 different numbers to keep in our mind how much can this cost depending on different workloads. I've started with a small company, which I think for all 3 of those, I'm hitting the top limits, but probably you have your own perception of these numbers. A small company, I said, would generate roughly 1,000 documents that they would like to store. They have no integrations. So they have no need for a storage account where they would drop a file and external application would pick it from there. They only have locally redundant backups. And at this point, they're paying for 100 gigabytes. And that comes down to €5.19. For a medium company, we're looking at 5,000 documents per month. We have 10,000 operations. Let me explain how to interpret this 10,000 operations. This relates to integrations. So here I'm assuming that per month, the company is gonna drop 5,000 files in a storage account. An external application is gonna pick those 5,000 files, process them, and drop 5,000 results in that storage account. And then our application has to read those 5,000 result files. And that's how we would end up with 10,000 write operations and 10,000 read operations. So this is what the 10,000 integration operations here means. They have a zone redundant backup. And at this point, they're paying for 500 gigabytes of storage. And this workload comes down to €17.25. And then I've multiplied this workload by 5 for a big company, somebody who would want to store 25,000 documents. They have 50,000 operations. They have geo-redundant backups. At this point, they are storing 2.5 terabytes of data. And you can see that the end cost was €95.93. Though I've mentioned before that we can optimize these costs for colder storages, for colder storage accounts. So I tried to do the same thing. I added some cold storages and added the numbers how this scenario could look if the price was optimized. And these are the numbers that I came up with. Once we include colder storages and how we're going to be moving data from hot storage to cold storage and keep the archives there, I came down to €34.94. So you can see that between the medium and big company, there's a five time increase in the workload, in the number of files, but only a double increase in the costs related to it. So with that being said, we are nearing the end. So lastly, I have a couple of key takeaways from you, for you. One is, let's move away from on-prem code. We all want to have, well, some customers want to be on-prem, yes, but I want us to enable any customer to have the choice. Do you want to stay on-prem or do you want to go to the cloud? So just let's stay away from on-prem code as much as possible, preferably always. Next, knowledge of Azure is a requirement that is here to stay. We talked about Azure Blob Storages here and backups, but there's also Azure Functions, Key Vaults, Logic Apps. there's a lot of resources that kind of go hand in hand with Business Central development. So the way technology is evolving, Azure is not going away. Azure is going to stay here. So let's embrace it. The next point is there's more to consider than just APIs and code. As non-developers, I don't think I have to convince you of this point. But for me, I know a lot of the times as a developer, I was just, ooh, Azure, let's go. I implement something, an API call here, an API call there, I'm done. But there's data security concerns, there's billing concerns, there's maintainability concerns. So just think about what does it mean to include an additional component into your architecture of your solutions. And finally, blob storage, even at its priciest, is still cheaper than database editions. We've seen that 1 gigabyte of additional database size is $10. 100 gigabytes in hot storage is $22. So blob storage is the cheaper option there. Finally, I'm going to say thank you. Thank you for being here with me. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat, or you can find me on various different networks. I would also invite you, like I did at the beginning, if you have any topics that you think are complex, that are hard to understand, shoot me a message, shoot Companion a message, and we can turn that into a format that's maybe easier to understand. So in any case, yeah, find me on LinkedIn, find me on Twitter, and that's all from my side. Thank you. Yeah, the recording and the slides will be sent out to anyone who's registered, I believe. Or even if it's not, I always upload all of my slides that I do for presentations like this on my blog. So stay tuned there. Can you give examples of what kind of documents to think about to store in BC? Does it include the images, and shall we first consume the data included database capacity? No, my kind of take is never store files in the database unless this is going to be your full approach. So what kind of files to store in BC? The most common one that I've seen with customers that are storing files in the database are, for example, incoming documents, right? Some scans of the invoices that you got into your company. So that scan, you simply store it into the database because that's where you work with it. My preference is that even pictures, anything that can go to a blob storage would go to a blob storage. Though, you have more mature customers, you have less mature customers. So given the pros and cons that we've seen at the earlier part of the presentation, is something that you have to consider which way you're going to go. Okay. If there are no other questions, thank you again for attending.